Good morning, everyone. My name is Genevieve Plumadore. I am the Vice President of Government Relations here at the Medical Alley Association, and on behalf of Medical Alley, I want to welcome you to our 2017 legislative session wrap-up for the state of Minnesota. Along with myself and President and CEO Shay Mandel and Stephen Chang, our Manager of Public Policy, we make up your lobbying and advocacy team here at the association. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. There is a handout, a PDF of the PowerPoint that I'm going to be presenting this morning attached to your webinar platform, so make sure to download that and follow along. And then if you have any questions during and after the presentation, Stephen Chang is here with me and he will be fielding questions. So again, on your webinar platform, there should be the ability to have questions inputted so that we can have a discussion here as we go along. So please feel free as we go through the PowerPoint. If you have any questions, stop us, send in those questions, and we'd be happy to field them as we go along with the presentation. Wonderful. Well, Minnesota is the great state of health, and Medical Alley is surely the capital of that great state. This is the message that we convey on a daily basis in the halls of the Capitol here in St. Paul, as well as on Capitol Hill in DC, and we work on your behalf. Just a good snapshot of the mantra that we work through every day here at the association and what Medical Alley Association means. We are the collective voice and expertise of Medical Alley, the strategy, implementation, and execution vehicle of the Medical Alley community. We deliver the collective influence, intelligence, and interactions that support Medical Alley's global leadership. And what I'm going to focus on today is exactly that, the collective influence, intelligence, and interactions that support our global leadership in terms of health technology. This collective influence is my goal at the state capitol every day to ensure that legislators know and understand the importance and the impact of health technology and healthcare companies have on this state. So I'm going to go through and give you a little bit of a snapshot of how the 2017 session went. I'll start there and then go through some of the individual initiatives that Medical Alley had a personal stake in, worked proactively, worked defensively on, to again give you a snapshot, a flavor of what it is that we do at the Capitol on a daily basis. So again, this is going to solely focus on the Minnesota State Advocacy Agenda. And again, session started early in January and ended in late May. This was the first year in a two-year biennium cycle, meaning that it is the year that elected officials are tasked with crafting a two-year budget for the state. The number that was settled on after negotiations is roughly about $47 billion, and I'll go into a little bit more about how that was broken down. But significant about this year in Minnesota politics is that the political landscape changed dramatically from the last few election cycles. For one, the Minnesota State Senate was led by the Republican caucus, by the GOP caucus. Only one other time had this happened in the last 42 years of the state's history. Traditionally, the Senate has been in Democratic control, and so this was, pretty significant. We had a new set of leaders being led in the Senate by Senator Paul Gazelka, who is a seasoned legislator, has been around the block for a while, but it was his first time in a leadership position. The Speaker of the House was still Kurt Doudt, who is rumored to be running for governor, which I think further complicates the political landscape as well as we went through the session this last year. And I'll talk a little bit more about the upcoming gubernatorial race in 2018 at the end of the presentation. So along with new leadership, we had a total of 40 new members in both the House and the Senate. So always in a new, after an election cycle, a big part of our lobbying efforts are focused on educating those new members to know exactly what it is that you do every day as companies here in Medical Alley. So we sought to embark on a very intensive education effort to make sure that all of these members understood the impact of our industries in the state, a great opportunity to begin relationships with individuals who may not necessarily represent companies. I'm thinking of Greater Minnesota legislators or legislators that may just not have the understanding of what health technology is. So it's a great opportunity to let them know about why it's important to the state, the economic impact, kind of go through all of the numbers. That brings me to the next slide. This is the type of information, this is the type of data that we like to share with our legislators. 167,000 Minnesotans directly and indirectly employed by Medical Alley companies. The average compensation on an annual basis is about $120,000. There are 931 health technology companies that call Minnesota home. That's huge. It's a huge number to be able to bring to legislators so that they, again, really understand the impact of the industry. And the annual economic impact to the state is about $23 billion. So we are by far in one of the top 4 industries that the state has strong constituencies in, and we bring this message to the Capitol and to our legislators. Additionally, we like to focus on the great state of healthcare, the great state of Minnesota, and the 150 years of healthcare innovation that have really made us stand out as a state in terms of healthcare on both the larger national scale, but then also on the global scale. From the first implantable pacemaker to the 150-plus year history of the Mayo Clinic to pioneers of transplantation medicine and science, we tell the story of Minnesota's Medical Alley at the Capitol, and we hope that we will convince those legislators to lend support to many of our initiatives that directly benefit not only our member companies, but ultimately patients. So here is a snapshot of the legislative agenda that we proactively worked on this year at the Capitol. As you can see, there's a wide-ranging, good mix of topics that brought us into working on tax initiatives and incentives, changes to the Pharmacy Practice Act, and to policy that would directly affect biopharmaceutical companies. We supported targeted economic development incentives, and finally, we're very supportive of many initiatives for our research institutions in the Mayo Clinic and and the University of Minnesota.
And this is Stephen. Genevieve, we're getting a question. How was the legislative agenda received by both parties and the governor?
Great question. We actually, we are a nonpartisan, bipartisan association, so we don't endorse candidates, we don't take sides. We really present an agenda that all sides can get behind, and so we had a lot of support both from the GOP-led House and Senate, as well as from the governor's office. It's very well received from both sides of the aisle. Great question. So as many of you probably heard and saw on the news, there was a very tumultuous end to the legislative session this year. The legislature constitutionally has to end on a mandated date, and the date this year was May 22nd. The legislature did not get their work done. Much to their chagrin, they had implemented a lot of strategies to try to present a budget to the governor's office before the end of the constitutionally mandated end date. Many of those bills were vetoed and, again, started to brew some animosity between the leadership. A deal, quote unquote, was finally struck close to midnight on that last day. And ultimately what ended up happening was that they adjourned the regular session, and then immediately thereafter at about 12:30 a.m. the next morning, the governor called the legislature back and they began a special session. What was deal that was struck on May 22nd, the governor had asked that the legislature finish their work within a 24-hour period, and it ended up being upwards of a 70-hour period that they did finally get their work done on the Friday of that same week. One of the things that has come out in the course of the last couple of weeks since the end of session is that there was a lot of language that had not been agreed upon that was slipped into the bills, and with the hasteness in which they finished the session, there were some things that both sides did not agree upon that were finally included in those final bills. As you probably have followed and have heard also on the news, that there is most likely going to be a lawsuit where the legislators are going to be suing the governor. They believe that there was a violation of the powers that the governor has. The governor line item vetoed the budget for the legislature. So starting July 1st, there will no longer be a legislative budget, and his tactic for using that is to hold the legislators accountable for some of the language that did slip into those final bills, and have them come back for an additional special session to hash out those indiscrepancies and those things that he was adamantly opposed to. Governor Dayton was unwilling to veto the entire budget and start from scratch because he went through a special session a few years ago where you have angry constituents calling and saying they want their park passes and they want to be able to go to the state parks, and so he wanted to avoid really hurting the state of Minnesota by holding the legislators accountable. But many political observers do believe that this partisan bickering has poisoned the well, and it will make next session very difficult to find common ground between both sides. So if we've got no questions, I'm going to keep going here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of the budget bills and talk about some of the initiatives that we had some direct influence on and had worked on. The first that I'll start with is the Omnibus Tax Bill. So it actually had been about 4 years since we last saw a tax bill passed in the state of Minnesota. The bill had roughly $660 million in tax cuts across the board. The governor was initially not going to sign this bill. He had received some advice from the Attorney General's office that if he didn't sign it, because he had some issues with some of the provisions in the bill, that it would just become law. But actually, because it was a special session bill, it would have been pocket vetoed, and then we wouldn't have had the tax bill. There would have been no passage of the tax bill. So one of the most important initiatives that we worked on this session was the Research and Development Tax Credit. As many of you know and have been following our work here for the last 3 years, this has been an initiative of ours since then. I'll break it down by the 3 different initiatives that were talked about, and then I'll focus a little bit on the one that actually did pass. So in 2010, the Research and Development Tax Credit was made refundable by the legislature, and that refundability was in law from 2010 till 2013. It was one of the most, according to our membership, one of the most successful economic development tools that the state had. Not many states make that credit refundable. The ability to have refundability really helped a bulk of our small and mid-sized companies who were able to take that refundable tax credit and infuse capital into their business within that taxable year instead of waiting to have the benefit of that credit 7 to 10 years down the road when they actually had a taxable liability. It's an expensive tax credit. When it was passed in 2010, the Department of Revenue was off by their estimates of the amount of R&D happening in the state by about $80 million, which is why in 2013 refundability was removed from statute. So it just goes to show the significant impact that research and development, that the research and development tax credit has in the state and the amount of R&D that's actually happening in the state. That did not pass. There was some language to have that first tier capped at $100,000, where the refundable credit would be capped at that amount. It made it all the way until the end of the process, but then ultimately, as the deals were being struck, that did not make it into the final tax bill. But we will for sure bring that back up to the attention of the legislature in the next 2 years here. The second piece is the second tier of the tax credit. So any research and development done above $10 million, we currently had in statute that 2.5% of that would be returned back to the taxpayer. In the state, in our advocacy efforts, we had a 50-state analysis that we presented to the legislature that showed where the rest of the states that vie for our health technology companies, where they landed in terms of the second tier, and Minnesota by far was on the bottom rung of that. So we moved from 2.5% to 4%, which on its face doesn't look like a lot, but in terms of the amount of R&D that's happening, again, over $10 million, that's a very significant amount for our companies, and that has become law as of the last couple of weeks. And then lastly, the Alternative Simplified Credit. That is an initiative that came out of not a member company of ours, but it seeks to allow companies that are applying for the R&D tax credit to use the Alternative Simplified Credit. It's a methodology in which you can choose that methodology versus the base amount methodology that Minnesota has. It would mimic the federal language, so many argued that it would administratively be an ease for taxpayers who are using that ASC election on the federal level to be able to use that same election in Minnesota without having to recalculate the tax credit in the state. We were very supportive of this initiative. Again, much like the first tier refundability, there was some question about how expensive it would be. It did make it all the way until the last iteration of the tax bill, but ultimately the bill that became law, it did not pass within that structure. Great. So next, the Angel Investment Tax Credit. This is an initiative that Medical Alley has been involved with. Even before my time, Medical Alley was very active in the lobbying effort to get the tax credit initially passed in 2010. It was not funded this year. It was not a part of the larger tax package. This is by far the biggest disappointment of the session for our association. We fought long and hard to keep the credit in statute, and unfortunately fell short. Early in the process, it wasn't included in any of the earlier versions of the tax bill. It was not even given a hearing in the Senate. So there was definitely there's definitely some additional education that needs to be done on our part of legislators to have them understand the importance of the tax credit and how it helps to leverage additional investments into the state of Minnesota. You know, many legislators are fixated on that famous jobs number, and you know, when we're dealing with high technology companies that are going through the FDA process, and ultimately won't become profitable within, you know, the first 7 to 10 years of their existence, they have a hard time wrapping their heads around the ROI on, oh, well, only 300 jobs have been created with this tax credit. So we have to do a better job of educating them and letting them know that, yes, the jobs number may be low, but these are high-paying jobs. These companies will, you know, could potentially ultimately become the next Medtronic, 3M, Boston Scientific, St. Jude, and if they are acquired, most likely those jobs would stay here in Minnesota, and you know, just have to do a better job of educating the legislators on that. Like I mentioned early in the process, it wasn't included in any of the early versions of the tax bill. It was in Governor Dayton's budget, and we were very vocal to all members of the legislature and to Governor Dayton about how important the credit was for our membership and our constituents. We had over 200 calls into the governor's office when we saw that it wasn't in that first iteration of the tax bill to call on Governor Dayton to continue to advocate on behalf of our membership and others in the high technology fields. The one bright side is that the sunset was extended by a year, so even though there may not be any money going into the tax credit, there is the ability to come back next year if we have additional money in the budget, in the supplemental budget, to infuse the tax credit again with some funds.
And we're getting another question here, and the question is, how much money is currently left in the annual investment tax credit fund?
Sure. So last session, the tax credit was funded at $10 million. And my understanding, I think I pulled the numbers last week, there was still about half of that tax credit was still available, about $5 million. Great. So moving on to the Jobs and Economic Development Omnibus Bill. The Minnesota Investment Fund was funded at $12.5 million per year. This was a top priority for the Medical Alley Association. It was included in our legislative agenda. Just for some reference, for those of you not familiar with this fund, it is a fund that is available, an economic development incentive that's available to the Commissioner of Deed to incentivize companies to either look at Minnesota, grow in Minnesota, set up roots here. Many of our companies have taken advantage of this. Most significantly, I will mention Smith's Medical. One of the reasons they chose to grow their operation here in Minnesota and ultimately have their North American headquarters here is because of some of these types of economic development incentives, and the Minnesota Investment Fund was one of them. At the end of session last year, there were some end-of-the-year shenanigans where the final budget, the final bill from last year defunded the Minnesota Investment Fund as well as the Job Creation Fund, and this put over 70 projects in peril, of which 20 to 30% of those projects were health technology company related. So again, another reason why this became a priority for us to help to lobby legislators and let them know the importance of these types of incentives to get companies to not only consider Minnesota, but then set up roots and grow here. This also was a top priority for the governor, and again was funded at $12.5 million per year. One item on the Minnesota Investment Fund that I just want to touch on, there were some restrictions that were passed this year which we were not supportive of. It essentially allows municipalities who utilize these funds to attract companies to their localities to use any of those uncommitted funds that they have received from the state to use them for other purposes that they deemed worthy. And they could do this at one time, and there would be a 20% penalty to do so. So again, we were not supportive of this language. We feel that it diluted the original intent of the economic development incentive. If it's not used to have a company come to Minnesota or grow in Minnesota, then it shouldn't be used for any other purpose, and really it's any purpose that the municipality would find value in. So it could be paving roads or fixing a pothole, or so we just felt like that was, again, diluting the intent of the original language. And then again, I mentioned the Job Creation Fund. Also, it's kind of a pay for play, so it works in conjunction with the Minnesota Investment Fund. That was funded at $8.5 million per year. The Minnesota Trade Office, who we do a lot of work with, Kathleen Motzenbecker is now our Senior Vice President. She's the former Minnesota Trade Office head. They were funded at $4.6 million for their budget. And the SciTech Experience internship program, that was funded at $2.5 million. This is a program that's housed out of the Minnesota High Tech Association that matches STEM interns with qualifying companies by providing matching funds from the state. So on average, about a quarter of those internships come from biotechnology and life science companies. So it's a platform for companies to be able to interact with students and, not just students, but actual, valuable candidates that are focused in the STEM field.
And we're getting a question about the SciTech Experience Internship Program, which is how much of the funds are matched to employers?
Great question. If you're interested, I invite you to visit our website or contact me afterwards, but I believe it's about $2,500 per student. So again, if you're a small startup or you're just getting off the ground, this is a great opportunity to be able to have access to some really great young talent and be able to be compensated by the state as well. Great, so moving along, the Omnibus Higher Education Bill. So this bill deals with funding for the University of Minnesota, the MnSTU College System, Office of Higher Ed, et cetera. So I'll just go through some of these initiatives that we cared about. Obviously, funding for the University of Minnesota, we specifically supported money for the Academic Health Center, the $22.25 million appropriation, Mayo Clinic and their school, $1.3 million. The University of Minnesota and Mayo Foundation Partnership, they receive a standing grant of almost $8 million a year in regen medicine. That's a 10-year commitment from the state. And the MnDrive Cancer Trials Network, I'll spend a little time on this. We really loved this initiative and gave it our all lobbying at the Capitol. It was a part of our legislative agenda and a part of our education tour with new legislators. So this essentially, the university was asking the state for money to create a network of cancer trial hubs throughout the state, I think it was 5 hubs total. And if you recall, fairly recently, the University of Minnesota was a recipient of NIH money that was specifically passed under the former Vice President Joe Biden's Cancer Moonshot Initiative. So they found a real opportunity to not only grow their cancer trials, but also grow their work in cancer research. And this ultimately was funded at $8 million. Again, it creates a network of hubs throughout the state for patients with cancer to have access to some of these life-saving therapies instead of having to drive to the Twin Cities on a weekly, sometimes twice-a-week basis to receive their drugs. Great, and then the next item that I wanted to point out is some more money was put into the Spinal Cord Injury and Traumatic Brain Injury Research Grant Program. This was put in for $3 million per year, so $6 million total. 2 years ago, the group Get Up, Stand Up for Paralysis was at the Capitol meeting with legislators wanting to start such a grant program. They initially had $1 million from the state that was dispersed over the last 2 years. And the funding was used on many projects that many of our companies have either started or were the idea was sown at those companies. One in particular that I can think of is there's one with St. Jude Medical specifically on spinal cord injury and using stimulation. So really exciting stuff. Again, in the grand scheme of things, doesn't sound like a lot of money, but the fact that the state is putting in that much money behind this project, it just goes to show, how much they value research. And so we will continue to monitor that program, see what great technologies come out of that research funding, and we'll continue to report on that. The last part of the Omnibus Higher Ed bill that I wanted to mention was that there was some language passed around fetal tissue research. If you've been following our work here the last couple of years, there was some, this is a leftover issue from last session. There was some appetite from GOP legislators to institute a statewide ban where no state-funded institution would be allowed to engage in fetal tissue research. Because the University of Minnesota is our only R1 institute, we really advocated, no statewide ban, no ban at the university, because that ultimately would mean a statewide ban for the state. There was some language that established a fetal tissue research committee within the scheme at the University of Minnesota. And although the Medical Alley Association was not supportive of this language, we understood it was the best compromise that could have been reached under the circumstances and with the political climate, with the political players that were involved. And I failed to mention at the beginning of the webinar, but our big end of session report is going to be published tomorrow, and so you'll have full access to all of the language, and you'll be able to kind of parse out exactly, for example, how that council is established and whatnot. Great. The Omnibus Health and Human Services Bill, we followed many of the initiatives in there. It is a huge bill, so rather than kind of go through some of the issues that we worked on, I thought I'd focus on one. The Biomedicine and Bioethics Innovation Grant Program was established. This is a program that in statute says it must promote research that leads to new discoveries that make advancements to health and strengthen the state's innovation economy. The grants are going to be awarded by a steering committee from the University of Minnesota and Mayo Foundation. The stipulation for this grant program is that it promotes and funds research that does not include the use of fetal tissue. This was language that was developed by Representative Matt Dean, who felt very strongly and had very strong convictions on the use of fetal tissue, but ultimately understood the value of innovation and how a statewide ban would look to the rest of the country, to the rest of the world. So he came up with this idea to fund some fund some research that push innovation, but do it without the use of fetal tissue. Okay, moving on. The Omnibus Bonding Bill. So this bonding bills are normally passed in even-numbered years of the two-year biennium. So some would say odd that it passed this year, but we didn't have a bonding bill last year. So this was a top priority of the governors, a priority of many within both the House and Senate, GOP and DFL caucus. And and I wanted to focus on two of the issues. The University of Minnesota was asking for $66 million for their health sciences education facility. Many of our companies work there on a daily basis. A lot of our talent has come from the University of Minnesota, and this money would help to rebuild the health center on the Twin Cities campus. So, of course, we were very supportive of this initiative, and we were glad to see that it was a part of that larger bill. Additionally, the Higher Education Asset Preservation and Replacement Fund, or fondly known as HEAPR, $20.6 million was given to the University of Minnesota for maintenance, preservation, and replacement of infrastructure. Great. So some additional bills of interest to our community. We were actively involved in helping to pass the medical faculty licensure changes to the medical faculty license in the state of Minnesota. This is for foreign-trained physicians who our academic health centers want to have come and do research and teach and be a part of the research enterprise in Minnesota. The language involved in the statute is defines, extraordinary talent in the same way that the Justice Department does when they're granting visas for extraordinary talent and researchers and scientists to come to the United States. So this was initially passed last year on a kind of a pilot basis, and has been utilized a number of times by Mayo, by the Mayo Clinic and the University of Minnesota, and so we helped to make it into law without a sunset. So that is on that one. And then the next bill, we worked on some biosimilars legislation. So biosimilars are, to put it in the most basic terms, they are the generic equivalent of a biologic drug. And as biologics become the next phase of medicine, the next frontier, pharmacy practice acts, when they were initially passed, only dealt with formularies and prescription drugs and generic drugs. And so now that biologics are a part of the pharmacy system, there has been a push by national coalition led by a couple of big pharma companies as well as the larger Biotechnology Association to update those pharmacy practice acts. And so Medical Alley led the charge on that here in the state, along with a national coalition. As a publication of our report, Minnesota was the 28th state to adopt the legislation, and the legislation is popping up throughout the country. So again, it just allows a pharmacist to be able to substitute or interchange a biosimilar rather than the biologic. Again, this will help access for patients. It'll help with lowering drug costs and lowering healthcare costs. We had a great reception at both the House and the Senate and the governor's office. It passed unanimously out of both of the houses and was ultimately signed by the governor at the end of session. Okay, so some other bills of interest that I wanted to touch on that we actively worked on. There was an opioid stewardship bill that was introduced early on in session. This bill would have taxed every opioid sold in the state of Minnesota. So the way that the language was written, it would have been 1 cent per milligram of opioid, or per milligram of opioids sold into the state. We were opposed to this legislation. We felt that a tax on the industry was not a way to combat the opioid problem. This is truly a crisis, not just in Minnesota, and not just in Minnesota, but across the country. And there was some additional exposure and some additional want and need to do something, in light of Prince's death. A couple of the legislators that had introduced the legislation have had a personal story with their own children dying of an opioid overdose. So it was a very hard issue to engage in, but we really felt like we needed to tell the story of the innovation that's happening in the state, and that there are other stakeholders that need to be held accountable in terms of this crisis. So we were supportive of some other initiatives to help curb the opioid crisis, but ultimately had to oppose this tax on industry, and again, brought to the attention of legislators pain management alternatives, alternatives to opioids that are being developed by our companies here in the state. We brought forth information about manufacturers that are actually in the state that would have been, priced out of even being competitive here in the state of Minnesota. So ultimately that bill was not passed, but we foresee this to still continue to be a hot topic moving into the next legislative session. Medical Alley is going to be hosting a series of pain management roundtables around alternatives to opioids and what the legislature can do to help encourage our payers and providers to reimburse for some of those alternatives. One of the most eye-openings that for me and for a lot of the legislators that I worked with is that there are alternatives out there, but they're just not reimbursed. For example, a pain pump, is reimbursed at $300 versus a $30 a bottle of opioids that's, for a 30-day supply. And so looking at what the societal costs are to having that bottle of pills versus the technology is something that we're going to work on to help educate legislators here in the future. Okay, great. The next bill is the Right to Repair bill. So this bill was introduced in the last couple of years at the legislature. It was reintroduced again early within the first set of bill introductions this year. Senator Osnick was the chief author, and he is ultimately looking for the ability for third-party consultants to be able to repair your electronics. So think of your cell phone, you have to take it to a Genius Bar. If you want to get your Apple phone restored, why not have the ability to bring that into your local mom and pop shop, local technology hub to be able to do that for you without invalidating the warranty. So doesn't sound like something that we would care about. However, the way that the bill language was written, it was very all-inclusive to all electronics, which would have included some medical devices that have an electronic component, as well as electronic monitors that are found in a medical setting. So you think of your CT scanner or big equipment like that have to be serviced by the company in order for their efficacy to be a part of the warranty. So we worked with the legislator to include some language that would have exempted medical devices and those found in a medical setting, those monitors found in a medical setting. The bill was never heard again after the initial introduction. So the author has our language. Our understanding is that he is supportive of that language, doesn't want to bring in medical devices or medical equipment into the fray, but we will closely monitor this to see if it does get some additional legs next session. We were a part of a larger coalition, of kind of those big tech names that you would think of, that, we just couldn't be supportive of this if it was going to allow for third-party administrators to have access to our intellectual property and our instruction manuals and all of that fun stuff. So we will be on the lookout for that next session. Great, a couple of other bills. The Research and Development Authority, this is a bill that was introduced last year by Representative Paul Thiessen, who was minority leader last year. He was not in leadership this year, but also continues to believe this is something that's important for the state to invest money into research and development here in the state. We are supportive of this legislation. We've been working with him on some additional language changes. Because he is in the minority and was the only author on the legislation, it didn't go anywhere, but we will continue to monitor and be supportive as it moves through the process. Representative Erin Murphy introduced a bill on regenerative medicine. She was the original author of that regenerative medicine grant that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. And this bill would have infused $100 million specifically into regen medicine happening here in the state. We obviously super supportive of this legislation, sort of in the same boat as Representative Thiessen. Representative Murphy is in the minority. It did not receive a hearing, and there was no Senate companion to this bill. And then, lastly, the SBIR-STTR grant match. There was a bill that was introduced that was developed by the Minnesota High Tech Association to create a grant match program. Some of the language for this grant match is included in that R&D authority bill that I mentioned earlier. So obviously super supportive. It was a little bit late in the session, but that doesn't mean that it won't come up for next year. It would match dollar for dollar grants that were developed under Phase 1 or Phase 2 under the SBIR-STTR program. Okay, any questions? No questions. Okay, well, good. Hopefully I'm answering all the questions here. So one of the last things that I wanted to touch on was the governor's race coming up in 2018. You know, Governor Dayton is not running for re-election. He announced that last year. You know, this session we had a number of candidates that were legislators, so that was sort of complicating the landscape as we were going through the legislative session. Many suspected that Lieutenant Governor Tina Smith was going to run for the DFL endorsement. Her visibility had increased significantly in the last few years. Huge proponent of ours, you know, definitely was a big supporter of our health technology industries. But it turns out she is not running. So this has sort of opened the floodgates for additional candidates and more prognostication of what's going to happen. So be prepared for a lot of campaign ads and some heavy advocacy on behalf of the Democrats. It's a priority of the DFL to ensure that the governor's office remains in DFL hands, considering that the Senate will remain in GOP hands for the next 3 years, and the House will remain. The House could potentially remain in GOP hands at the next election as well. So like I mentioned, some gubernatorial candidates that have already declared their intent to run. There's a long list. And so who's running for governor? Everyone is right now. So I'll just mention a few key ones. St. Paul Mayor Coleman is actually now a front runner based on some polling that just came out recently. Congressman Tim Walz, who we have worked with in the past. I kind of put him as the front runner. He has that greater Minnesota appeal. Representative Erin Murphy is running. Representative Tina Liebling, this is all on the Democratic side. The legislative auditor, Rebecca Otto. Thiessen is a question mark if he's going to throw his hat in the ring. On the Republican side, Representative Matt Dean is running. Hennepin County Commissioner Jeff Johnson, and a couple of other candidates, but really the ones that we've been following. You know, the Speaker of the House has been rumored for many years that he has his sights on the governor's office. So we'll be watching for any announcements from him in the near future. Senator Benson, who is the Health and Human Services Chair in the Senate, there's been some rumors that she's considering a run. A good friend of our association would be, you know, supportive of that. Keith Downey, Senator Osmek, the author of the Right to Repair bill. So this oftentimes complicates the landscape for us, you know, to see who's running and what intentions people have for introducing legislation and to get on the news and get a soundbite and whatnot. So it should be an interesting next year here for us as we move into the election cycle. So I'll wait here a few minutes, see if anyone has any additional questions. Give people a second to type here if we have anything.
You had mentioned earlier before that the governor is planning on defunding the state legislature. Do you see that complicating business for next year?
Absolutely. We definitely foresee some bad blood. The governor has asked for a meeting with the legislative leaders. That just happened yesterday, and so we're hopeful that there may be some compromise or something that will be able to come to fruition. But some of the issues that he had with the bills, you know, included some budgetary issues, education, licensure issues, tobacco tax, refunds. So there are items that are important to the governor. So and he's not running, you know, for office again. So I do foresee that that will definitely complicate the matters.
Okay. And what issues do you see being at the forefront for next session?
For the association, yeah, that's a great question. So definitely the angel investment tax credit, we will continue to fight for that next session. Traditionally, in the second year of a biennium, it's not a budget year. It's usually focused on policy, but we have had a surplus the last couple of years here in the state. We foresee some amount of a surplus for next year. So depending on what that amount is, we will definitely be very active in trying to support the angel investment tax credit. I still think that we can get refundability or some portion of refundability to be hyper-focused on some of our companies. So I will continue to do some education of the legislature on behalf of the R&D tax credit, and also, you know, say thank you for the work that they did do on that tax credit in light of there was a somewhat negative Office of the Legislative Auditor's report that was published earlier in the year. So it made our work that much harder to ensure that that we had some competitive changes made to the tax credit. And
got a question here. You mentioned earlier that Medical Alley, or Minnesota rather, has 931 health technology companies. Can you kind of elaborate on what the breakdown looks like in the industry for medical device, pharmaceuticals, and support industry?
That is a great question. I don't have those statistics. I think that's a Frank question for those of you who know Frank on the line. But I'm happy to send an email out once we wrap up the webinar with any follow-up, and we'll include that information as well.
I think we're getting another question about the research and development credit. If you see there being any more pushes next session to enhance the formula even further.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely do think that it's an expensive tax credit, but if you look at what's happening on the national front, nationally it just became permanent, so there is no need to go back and lobby every year for the R&D tax credit. So that's huge on the federal side. On the state side, what really resonates with legislators too is the fact that Minnesota was the first state to pass the R&D tax credit in 1981, and really became a leader in terms of research and development. And this just again goes to show you those large Fortune 500 companies that we have right in our backyard, Medtronic, 3M, you know, now Boston Sci and St. Jude Medical, Abbott. Those are just, you know, Coloplast. I mean, I think of all of the companies that we have here that are engaged in high-level scientific research, and how the state of Minnesota had the forethought and the courage to pass an R&D state tax credit back in the 80s. You know, I kind of try to play on that history, play on those heartstrings when we meet with legislators to encourage them to have that same type of courage. Again, this year, one of the facets of the Office of the Legislative Auditor report that came out earlier this year is that, you know, again, the ROI isn't that great. You know, sometimes a company doesn't even survive even after they've been doing, you know, basic research for 3 years. And you know, it's really about teaching legislators that even if the project fails, there's some good coming out of that basic research. And there's a handful of legislators that get it, a lot of them on the tax committee, so that's good for us. But I definitely think, you know, just showing the power and the importance of our association, our companies, our innovations, I definitely think that there is some appetite to increase the competitiveness of that credit.
And we've got a question here regarding the tax credit and your slide on page 9, which is just to clarify, of the proposed changes to the R&D tax credit, the increase of the second tier to 2.5% to 4%, was that the only implemented change, or did the refundability option and ASC also get approved?
Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Yes, only the second tier. That was the only change that was made to the credit. So the first tier refundability was not in play in that final bill, and neither was the alternative simplified credit. But again, both of those initiatives are being championed by some heavyweights at the Capitol. So again, I definitely think that they're still in the mix for next year, and then possibly in 2019. Great. Okay, so no further questions. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us for the webinar. Like I mentioned, our report is less than 24 hours away from being unveiled. So everything that I talked about today, there will be some greater detail and some specific references to statutes and language that you can, further do some research on. But as always, please feel free to reach out to me. I am here for you. Myself and my team work on behalf of the members of Medical Alley. If you've got any questions, please feel free to reach out. And as we start to develop and look to the 2018 session, because yes, we are already thinking about January of 2018, let me know if you've encountered a great program, a great state program in another state, if you've had interactions with other entities that you would like to emulate here in the state. I'm always looking for ideas, and that's where our legislative agenda comes from. It really comes organically from the membership and what is needed, what is wanted, and we try to do our best at the Capitol to make it happen. So I appreciate all of your support. Thank you for being on the webinar, and again, please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Thank you.